The concrete felt cold against the back of his hands and he tasted metal in the air, sharp and tinny as a bell. He blinked once, twice, and everything came into focus. The silver SUV looming over the curb like a sleeping animal, the flash of high heels on the pavement, a cluster of voices that sounded like a swarm of bees, and then the small, muffled cry that made his heart slam against his ribs. It was a noise that belonged to someone fragile, the sound of breath trapped between panic and pain. It made him move before his brain could think of every reason not to. He crawled forward on his knees, pulling his shirt up to wipe grit from his palms. The world narrowed to the space under the vehicle and the pale little hand that reached out from under the axle. She was small, shorter than he had expected from the glimpses the cameras had shown of her at galas. Slim, with a head of hair that tumbled in careless waves, a dress that had become more of a smudge of color than a garment. Her eyes were wide and focused on him with a fierce intelligence that made him feel suddenly foolish for thinking beauty was all the world ever asked of her. He did not know her name in that instant. To the world she was a gilded headline, the millionaire's daughter. To him she was a breathing person counting the seconds and watching the sky, the way people do when they hold survival in the palm of a wish. The pavement around the SUV was chaotic. Phones had come out like tiny rescue flares. Cameras. Shots. A circle of people whose faces were lit with the last stage of spectacle, that strange, lopsided merger of horror and the hope of being useful. But nobody had moved close enough to lift the wheel. Something invisible kept them at bay, the fear that what they did could ruin a life, or their fear that whatever they did might require a kind of strength they did not have. He didn't have much himself. He had a name. The word Marcus had been stitched into a uniform at one point, but today he held a single identity. A man with greasy palms and a permanent fold on the side of his jacket from the long hours he spent on nights when other people were safe and bright. He worked at the estate as one of the cleaning staff. He had been on a 10-minute break, finishing a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, when the sharp squeal of brakes and the crunch of metal had sent him toward the wreck. He slipped under the SUV and found her squashed in the space between the tire and the curb, the metal of the fender pressing against her ribs. The tire was full of the weight of the world. He could see the way its shadow fell like a heavy ring around her waist. He reached and felt for the pulse at the side of her neck. It was fluttering like a moth trapped against glass. He moved his hands along the grooves of the asphalt behind him and felt the jagged edge of a rusted jack someone had thrown as an afterthought. His hands shook, but they found the jack and levered with a grunt. Metal groaned. People around them made louder noises as if lifted by some soundtrack. He managed inches, then more, feeling the whole SUV tilt with a whisper of motion. The air under the vehicle smelled of hot rubber and oil and the faint sweet tang of fear. The daughter's wail cracked like a blessing and the crowd pressed forward instinctively. A woman in a suit fussed with her phone, the screen reflecting a face that did not quite look like hers. A man muttered about filing reports. A child began to cry. The sound of footsteps and conversation was thick and unresolved. When the tire lifted enough for the girl's shoulder to clear, Marcus slipped his arms under her back and felt the smallness of her weight. She was slippery with sweat and the dress stuck to her like a second skin. He tugged and she rolled free, gasping and sobbing in short, scattered little breaths. Her skirt tore along the seam, but no one noticed. All eyes were fixed on the gap between life and disaster. The poor black maid had been the first to reach the SUV. She had always moved like she belonged to the hush of rooms after guests left. Silent, efficient, hands that knew the language of cleaning and comfort. Her name was Lila, spoken by some of the staff as if it were a private kindness. She had come to the estate when she was barely 22, carrying one battered suitcase and a lineage of quiet pride. She washed silverware until the spoons shone like moons. She ironed sheets with the care of someone who knew how to fold memory into cloth. She made the house hum with small kindnesses. A replaced light bulb before anyone noticed it went dark, a pot of tea brewed at exactly the right strength. The house did not belong to her, but it had carved out a place inside her chest where small blessings lived. She would tidy the children's rooms and tuck notes into pockets that no one read. She was never the kind of person who sought attention. She believed, in a simple, stubborn way, that dignity was not a thing to be displayed but a thing to be honored. When the SUV had braked and thudded against the curb, Lila had been carrying a tray of glasses. She had seen the panic flare and, without thinking, dropped the tray. Glass shattered into a mosaic of light around her feet, glittering as teeth. She had grabbed the nearest heavy object, a decorative stand meant for outside the drawing room, before she noticed the small hand under the SUV. She didn't see the cameras, the phones, the people who hovered at the margins. She simply saw the person in need. Her hands were capable in ways the rest of the household often took for granted. They could remove wine stains with a solution that smelled faintly of lemon, they knew the exact way to fold a collar so it bent like a question mark, and they understood how to hold a child's hair back so that the tangles eased without complaint. They were hands that could lift with precision and with care. No one believed at first that she could get the SUV to budge. The crowd was full of opinions that day, and those opinions were heavy. One of the estate's chauffeurs shouted that the vehicle's center of gravity could shift, that someone more trained should handle it. A man in a buttoned coat suggested calling emergency services and keeping the crowd back. But Lila's jaw set and she crouched down without thinking of authority or status. Her head was a simple, luminous thing of intention. She found a jack and set it under the frame where metal seemed willing to give its breath. When Marcus lunged under the SUV, she had been kneeling on the exact side where the fender had scraped the curb. She heard him curse and feel his hands fumble. She did not step back. She slid the tray of broken glasses aside with a foot and handed him a strap she used for lifting heavy linens. "Hold," she said. Her voice was calm and clear, and it hung in the air the way commands do when they have been practiced 1,000 times in domestic rooms. They worked together. The tire lifted with a slow pulse, as though it were a living thing deciding to be merciful. Marcus's arms burned. Lila's fingers were steady, rubbing at the sweat on her brow as she kept pressure with the jack. Then the most impossible thing happened. The SUV shuddered and settled, and the space formed like a doorway. They slid the daughter out, and the world exhaled. She was pale and shaking, and when she finally focused on faces, her eyes snagged on Lila's and widened. There was a second, a small prism of astonishment, where something in the daughter's gaze recognized the type of person who steps into the small margins and keeps the world from unraveling. Later, the papers would cut this into pieces. There would be a headline that called it mercy, another that called it heroism, still another that called it incompetence that nearly became tragedy. People loved to cut stories into neat frames and then parade them like proofs of their own morality. But at the time, in the smeared heat of that morning, no one could parse the simplicity of what had happened. Lila had acted and life had returned. The daughter coughed, and the cough was a small, necessary sound. There was a jagged cut on her temple and a bruise blooming at her clavicle. A paramedic who had finally arrived, late because the cars had been stuck in the private entrance, took one look and declared the child stable enough to move. They wrapped a blanket around her like a promise and placed her in the waiting arms of the estate's matron. For Marcus, the moment after the rescue tasted like a strange, bright coin. The world was loud with congratulations and with the tiny economic currency of social media. A deletion of an unflattering tweet, a post that would be edited to place the right people front and center. Cameras recorded Lila, and for the first time the staff noticed the way the light fell on her face when someone turned a flash that way. Phones zoomed in on the lines by her eyes and the calluses on her palms. People who had never met her suddenly made claims about what she must have felt. As soon as the daughter was tended to, the house filled with a certain energy, one that smelled faintly of cologne and old money and the sharp, sweet aroma of a press release being drafted in someone's head. The matron pulled the staff together, her voice a low, cowled thing. "We must ensure discretion," she said. "We do not want publicity. The father will be pleased that the child is safe. Make sure this does not leave the premises." She arranged all the pieces like an artisan packing porcelain. Lila shrank into the wash of authority. She wanted no fuss, no fanfare. The last thing she wanted was to be photographed like a trophy. She had done the thing because it needed to be done. But the world had its own appetite. A reporter from a local paper had already slipped in through the gate, with a notepad that trembled in his hands. He had the sort of smile that smelled of ambition. He found the moment when the daughter was wheeled into the house and the staff was glad hushed and asked questions. Who lifted the wheel? Who had saved the child? The matron's mouth was a sealed line. She dispatched answers like tiny courtesies. Lila felt eyes on her and tried to fold herself small. Marcus saw her flinch and stayed at her side, a human shield of silence. He had grown up with her in the household, watching the same rituals of staying unseen. He knew how easily kindness could be framed as spectacle and how dangerous it could be to be the center of a narrative that people wanted to shape. He remembered the first time he saw Lila. It had been a stormy night and she had arrived with a duffel bag, rain in the folds of her hair and a folded photograph of a family she could not afford to forget. She had said little but watched everything, learning the arteries of the house that hid in cabinets and wall panels. When the daughter was a toddler, Lila would sit on the floor and mend tiny shoelaces, humming to herself. The daughter had learned to whistle from her and would hide under a blanket in a game they called treasure hunt. They had grown in fits and starts, around each other's small mercies. But the world of papers and headlines saw only a dramatic tableau. Lila's name was smudged into a paragraph by a journalist who wanted a quick scoop, and then the paragraph was curled into a tweet and volleyed between strangers. The story became a currency by which people measured their own decency. There were emails from charities who wanted to nominate her for awards, people who asked to buy her story. There were offers of polite meals with foundations and interviews with so-called philanthropists who talked in slow, affectionate tones about how they empower people like Lila.